Hey everyone, and welcome back to Dewtime. I'm Isaiah, and today we're diving headfirst into the often murky, sometimes terrifying, and always fascinating world of medical history. Now, we often think of medicine as this bastion of science and reason, a steady march of progress from ignorance to enlightenment. We trust our doctors, we take our prescribed medications, and we generally assume that the people in charge of our health have a pretty good idea of what they're doing. But what if I told you that for most of human history, a trip to the doctor was more likely to kill you than cure you? That's because the path to modern medicine is littered with the metaphorical, and sometimes literal, corpses of ideas that were not just wrong but profoundly, shockingly bizarre. We're talking about treatments that seem more like something out of a horror movie than a physician's handbook. From prescribed poisons to surgical procedures that make you question the very sanity of the practitioners, the history of healing is a wild ride. So buckle up, because today we're going to explore some of the most outlandish and dangerous medical practices ever conceived. By the end of this journey, you'll probably be very, very grateful for your 21st century pharmacy, and maybe a little less likely to complain about having to get a flu shot. We're going to look at practices that were not fringe quackery, but mainstream, accepted medical science for centuries. These were the go-to solutions for the best educated minds of their time. And that, my friends, is perhaps the most unsettling part of all. Let's get into it. So, let's start with perhaps the most famous and longest-lasting medical mistake in history: bloodletting. The concept is deceptively simple. If you're sick, it's because your body's humors are out of balance. This idea, popularized by the ancient Greek physician Galen, dominated Western medicine for almost 2,000 years. The four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, were thought to correspond to the four elements, and good health depended on them being in perfect equilibrium. If you had a fever, or were too melancholic, or just generally felt unwell, the diagnosis was almost always an excess of one humor, usually blood. The logical, if deeply flawed solution: get rid of the excess blood. This wasn't some back-alley procedure, it was the height of medical sophistication. Kings, popes, and peasants alike underwent bloodletting for everything from a common cold and indigestion to pneumonia, and even insanity. It was the universal cure-all. The methods varied. The most common was venesection, where a doctor would make an incision in a vein, typically in the arm, and drain a specific amount of blood into a bowl. The amount was prescribed with the same seriousness we now reserve for milligrams of medication. The lancet, a small, sharp, double-edged blade, became the iconic tool of the trade, a symbol of the physician's power to intervene and rebalance the body's delicate systems. But if a vein wasn't accessible or the ailment was localized, there were other, more creative methods. Leeching, for instance, involved placing live leeches on the skin. These little critters would latch on and suck out blood, while their saliva, containing an anticoagulant, ensured a steady flow. This was considered a gentler, more targeted approach. Then there was cupping, where heated glass cups were placed on the skin to create a vacuum, drawing blood to the surface, after which the skin would be pierced to let it out. The problem, of course, is that draining the body of its life-sustaining blood is, scientifically speaking, a terrible idea. Blood carries oxygen, nutrients, and the very immune cells needed to fight off infection. By removing it, doctors were actively weakening their patients, making them more susceptible to the very illnesses they were trying to cure. The feeling of lightheadedness or fainting after a session was often misinterpreted as the fever breaking or the body relaxing, a sign the treatment was working. Think about the scale of this. For centuries, this was not a debate, it was fact. Medical texts contained intricate charts showing which vein to bleed for which specific ailment. Barber surgeons, who were more skilled with razors than with anatomy, often performed the procedure, hence the red and white striped pole you still see today, red for blood, white for bandages. It was an everyday, commonplace part of life and, frequently, death. The sheer volume of bloodletting that occurred is staggering. Records show patients being bled multiple times in a single day, losing pints of blood over the course of an illness. It's a classic case of the treatment being far worse than the disease. Many historians now believe that countless people who might have otherwise recovered from their illnesses were instead bled to death by their well-meaning but tragically misguided physicians. This wasn't just an ancient practice either. It persisted well into the 19th century. In fact, one of the most famous suspected victims of bloodletting was George Washington. After catching a throat infection in 1799, his doctors proceeded to drain him of an estimated 3¾ liters of blood, about half of his body's total volume, in less than 24 hours. He died shortly thereafter. His case became a flashpoint in the growing debate about the practice's efficacy. It took the rise of modern scientific medicine based on observation statistics and a better understanding of physiology to finally dethrone bloodletting. When doctors in Paris in the 1830s started actually counting and comparing patients, those who were bled versus those who weren't, they found a shocking truth. The bled patients had a much higher mortality rate. It was one of the first major uses of statistics in medicine, and it exposed a 2,000-year-old error. So the next time you feel a headache coming on, just be thankful that the recommended treatment is a couple of aspirin and a glass of water, not a sharp knife in a bowl. The story of bloodletting is a humbling reminder that even the most deeply entrenched common sense can be profoundly and lethally wrong, and that the history of medicine is a history of questioning everything, even the things we are most certain of. If bleeding a patient to death seems extreme, our next subject might just make you want to lie down. Let's talk about trepanation, the practice of drilling, cutting, or scraping a hole into the human skull. And here's the truly mind-boggling part. This is arguably the oldest surgical procedure known to humanity. We have found trepanned skulls dating back to the Neolithic era over 7,000 years ago from every corner of the globe. Why on earth would anyone voluntarily have a hole drilled in their head with what were essentially sharpened rocks? The prevailing theory is that it was a treatment for a variety of ailments believed to originate in the head. Think about it from a pre-scientific perspective. If someone is having epileptic seizures, debilitating migraines, or exhibiting signs of what we would now call severe mental illness, it might seem logical to assume something is trapped inside their skull, creating pressure. The solution, then, would be to create an escape route. A hole in the head could be seen as a way to release the evil spirits, the bad humors, or the physical pressure causing the suffering. In a world without painkillers, sterile equipment, or any real understanding of the brain, this was a desperate measure for desperate conditions. It was a physical intervention for problems that seemed metaphysical. The procedure itself was, as you can imagine, brutal. Archaeologists have identified several methods. One involved scraping away the bone layer by layer with a sharp flint tool. Another used a circular cutting tool, or a crown trephine, to carve out a round piece of bone, like a plug. A third, more direct method involved simply drilling 4 holes in a square and then cutting the bone between them to remove the section. What's truly astonishing is not just that they did this, but that people survived it. We know this because many of the ancient skulls we've found show clear signs of healing and bone regrowth around the edges of the hole. This indicates the person lived for weeks, months, or even years after the procedure. It speaks to the incredible resilience of the human body, but also, perhaps, to the skill of these ancient surgeons who somehow managed to operate on the skull without fatally damaging the brain or causing a deadly infection. This wasn't just a prehistoric fad either. The practice continued through ancient Greece and Rome, where physicians like Hippocrates and Galen wrote detailed instructions on when and how to perform trepanation, primarily for skull fractures to relieve pressure and remove bone fragments. But it was still used for things like seizures and melancholy, the belief in releasing bad spirits or vapors never fully disappearing. Into the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, trepanation remained in the surgical toolkit. It became a slightly more refined, though no less dangerous procedure, with the invention of metal surgical instruments. The brace and bit drill, a tool familiar to any woodworker, was adapted for use on the human skull. It was a common sight in the surgeon's bag, right next to the amputation saw and the bloodletting lancet. The reasons for performing it also remained a strange mix of the practical and the mystical. While it was a legitimate if risky treatment for things like a subdural hematoma, a brain bleed, it was also still prescribed for blindness, stupidity, and demonic possession. The hole was a gateway, a way to let the bad out and maybe just maybe let some good in. The decline of trepanation was a slow and gradual process. As our understanding of anatomy, infection, and the function of the brain grew through the 18th and 19th centuries, the idea of non-therapeutically drilling into the skull began to seem less like a cure and more like a form of assault. The rise of neurology as a discipline provided alternative explanations and treatments for conditions like epilepsy, rendering the practice largely obsolete for all but the most specific traumatic injuries. Yet, in a bizarre twist, trepanation has seen a small modern-day resurgence in some countercultural circles. Proponents of self-trepanation claim with absolutely no scientific evidence that drilling a hole in the skull can increase brain blood volume and lead to a higher state of consciousness. It's a fringe belief, to be sure, but it shows the enduring, almost mythical power of this ancient, brutal, and utterly fascinating surgical procedure. It's a hole in the head that has left a permanent hole in our historical imagination. Now let's move from surgery to pharmacology, or, well, what passed for it. If a doctor offered you a nice steaming cup of poison today, you'd probably run for the hills. But for centuries, one of the most potent poisons known to humanity, mercury, was a go-to medicine. Known as quicksilver for its liquid metallic appearance, mercury was used to treat a staggering array of diseases, but it became most infamously linked with one in particular, syphilis. Syphilis, known as the Great Pox, swept through Europe in the late 15th century, causing horrific symptoms, painful rashes, genital sores, tumors, dementia, and eventually death. It was a terrifying and highly stigmatized disease, and people were desperate for a cure. Into this environment of fear stepped mercury. The logic, such as it was, seemed to be one of sympathetic magic. A violent disease required a violent cure. The treatments were horrifically inventive. Patients might be given mercury to drink, or have it rubbed into their skin as an ointment. One of the most common and brutal methods was fumigation. The patient would be placed in a sealed box or tent with a heater burning mercury underneath. They would be forced to inhale the toxic vapors for hours on end, in the belief that it would sweat the disease out of their bodies. What it actually did was induce severe mercury poisoning. The most immediate side effect was profuse salivation. Patients would drool uncontrollably, sometimes producing several quarts of saliva a day. This was seen as a positive sign. The body was purging the syphilitic poisons. In reality, it was the first sign of systemic toxicity. The cure was literally a race to see if the mercury would kill the patient before the syphilis did. The full list of side effects is a catalog of horrors. Their teeth would loosen and fall out, their gums would rot away, and their breath would become foul. They would suffer from severe neurological damage, including tremors, known as Hatter's shakes from the mercury used in felt making, memory loss, and full-blown insanity. And of course, it caused catastrophic kidney and liver failure. The popular saying of the time was, "One night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury." It grimly acknowledged that the so-called cure was a life sentence of suffering. Yet for nearly 400 years, from the 16th to the early 20th century, it was the primary and accepted treatment for syphilis. Wealthy patients would travel to spas to undergo mercury cures under a physician's supervision, enduring weeks of agonizing poisoning. It wasn't just for syphilis either. Mercury, in the form of a compound called calomel, mercury chloride, was a common purgative. It was given to children for teething pain, to adults for constipation, and was even a key component of Dr. Benjamin Rush's heroic medicine in 18th century America. He called his mercury-laced purgatives thunderclappers, and prescribed them for almost everything, including yellow fever, likely killing more patients than the disease itself. Abraham Lincoln is another famous figure who likely suffered from mercury poisoning. He took popular patent medicines called blue mass pills, which contained mercury, to treat his lifelong struggles with what he called melancholy, what we'd now call depression. Friends and colleagues noted his erratic moods and fits of rage, symptoms which subsided after he, astutely recognizing the pills were making him cross, stopped taking them in 1861. The reign of mercury only ended with the dawn of modern chemotherapy. In 1910, Paul Ehrlich's lab developed salvarsan, the first truly effective treatment for syphilis. It was an arsenic-based compound, so still a poison, but it was far more effective at killing the bacteria and far less toxic to the patient. It was a magic bullet that finally made the brutal mercury cures obsolete. The story of the mercury cure is a powerful lesson in medical desperation. When faced with a terrifying, untreatable disease, both patients and doctors were willing to embrace a cure that was, in itself, a devastating poison. It highlights the fine line between medicine and toxin, and how without a scientific understanding of disease mechanisms that line can become terrifyingly blurred, leading to centuries of prescribed suffering. Our next practice is much more recent, a product of the 20th century's hubris and its struggle to understand the human mind. This is the story of the lobotomy, a procedure that promised a simple surgical fix for the complexities of mental illness and left a trail of devastation in its wake. For a brief, terrifying period, It was hailed as a miracle cure, and its inventor even won a Nobel Prize for it. The story begins in the 1930s with a Portuguese neurologist named Egas Moniz. At the time, mental asylums were overflowing with patients suffering from conditions like schizophrenia, severe depression, and anxiety, for which there were no effective treatments. Moniz theorized that these illnesses were caused by fixed or stuck neural pathways in the frontal lobes of the brain. His proposed solution? Surgically sever those pathways. His initial procedure, called a leucotomy, involved drilling holes in the side of the patient's head and injecting pure alcohol into the frontal lobes to destroy the tissue. He later developed an instrument called a leucotome, a long cannula with a retractable wire loop, to cut the connections more precisely. He claimed dramatic success, reporting that his patients became calmer and more manageable after the surgery. But the procedure was popularized and brutalized by an American physician named Walter Freeman. Freeman was a showman and a zealous promoter of the surgery, which he rebranded as the lobotomy. He believed Moniz's method was too slow and required a neurosurgeon and operating room. Freeman wanted a fast, cheap, assembly line procedure that could be performed by any psychiatrist anywhere. His solution was the transorbital lobotomy, better known as the ice pick lobotomy. The technique was shockingly crude. The patient was often rendered unconscious with electroshock. Freeman would then lift the patient's upper eyelid, insert a long, thin instrument that was literally modeled after an ice pick from his kitchen, and hammer it through the thin bone of the eye socket into the frontal lobes. Once inside the brain, he would swish the instrument back and forth, severing the connections. Sometimes he would do this to both sides of the brain. The entire procedure took less than 10 minutes. Freeman traveled the country in a van he called the Lobotomobile, performing thousands of these operations in state mental hospitals, often in front of an audience of doctors and nurses. The results were catastrophic. While the surgery did often reduce agitation and aggression, the cost was immense. Patients were left emotionally blunted, apathetic, and childlike. Their personalities were erased, their intellectual and creative capacities destroyed. They became passive and vacant. Freeman's own records, which he meticulously kept, show a devastating litany of outcomes: seizures, loss of motor control, and profound personality degradation. One of the most famous victims was Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of President John F. Kennedy. In 1941, at the age of 23, she underwent a lobotomy, prescribed by Freeman to treat her mood swings and rebellious behavior. The procedure left her with the mental capacity of a toddler, unable to walk or speak intelligibly. She was institutionalized for the rest of her life, her existence hidden from the public for decades. So why did this happen? It was a perfect storm of factors: overcrowded and underfunded asylums, the desperation of families, the lack of any other treatments, and the immense professional authority of doctors like Freeman. The lobotomy offered a simple, final solution to complex and messy human problems. It promised to make difficult patients easier to manage, a promise that many institutions found irresistible. The downfall of the lobotomy came in the mid-1950s with the development of the first effective antipsychotic medications, like Thorazine. These drugs could calm patients and reduce psychosis without surgically destroying their brains. As pharmacology offered a more humane and effective alternative, the lobotomy quickly fell out of favor, exposed as the barbaric and destructive procedure it truly was. The story of the lobotomy is a chilling modern cautionary tale. It happened in our grandparents' lifetime, celebrated by the medical establishment and the popular press. It's a reminder of what can happen when we seek easy answers to hard questions, when we devalue the lives of the mentally ill, and when the ambition of a single doctor is allowed to run unchecked. It stands as one of the most tragic chapters in the entire history of medicine. For our final and perhaps most ghoulish historical medical practice, we're heading to the pharmacy. But this isn't your local CVS. Imagine walking into an apothecary in Renaissance Europe and asking for a cure for a headache, a bruise, or even the plague. The pharmacist might reach for a jar filled with a brownish powder and sell you a dose of ground-up ancient Egyptian mummy. This is not a joke. For centuries, from the Middle Ages well into the 18th century, a substance called mumia was a standard and highly sought-after medicine in Europe. It was prescribed by the most respected physicians and consumed by the wealthiest patients. The belief was that the bitumen and resins used by the ancient Egyptians in the embalming process held powerful healing properties. The logic was, again, a form of sympathetic magic. It was thought that these substances, which had preserved a human body for thousands of years, must surely have the power to preserve a living one and ward off disease. The fact that the mummies were once pharaohs and nobles only added to their mystique and perceived potency. Consuming a part of a long-dead king was thought to impart strength and vitality. The trade in mummies became a lucrative, if grisly, business. Tombs in Egypt were plundered not for gold, but for bodies. The mummies were shipped to Europe, where they were ground into a fine powder in apothecaries. This powder was then used in tinctures, salves, or simply mixed with wine and drunk as a cure-all for an incredible range of ailments. It was prescribed for everything. Headaches, stomach ulcers, broken bones, coughs, and menstrual irregularities were all thought to be treatable with a dose of mumia. It was especially popular as a styptic, a substance that stops bleeding. Applying powdered mummy to a wound was a common practice, believed to staunch the flow of blood and promote healing. As demand for authentic Egyptian mummies outstripped supply, a gruesome counterfeit market emerged. Unscrupulous merchants would take the corpses of recently executed criminals, vagrants, or hospital patients, mummify them by stuffing them with bitumen and drying them in the sun, and then pass them off as ancient relics to unsuspecting pharmacists. The medicine wasn't just bizarre, it was often fraudulent. This practice of medical cannibalism, as some have called it, was surprisingly mainstream. It wasn't seen as ghoulish or strange by the people of the time. It fit neatly into a worldview where the body was a collection of substances and where potent materials could transfer their properties through consumption. King Francis I of France, for example, apparently never went anywhere without a small pouch of mumia, just in case. The use of mummy powder wasn't an isolated oddity, it was part of a broader tradition of corpse medicine. Other human-derived ingredients were also popular. Human fat was used in ointments for aches and pains. Human skull, especially from a person who had died a violent death, was ground up and used to treat epilepsy, based on the idea that the spirit was still present. Blood from young, healthy individuals was sometimes drunk by the elderly in a desperate attempt to regain youth. The decline of mummy medicine came with the rise of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. As physicians began to favor chemical-based remedies and a more rational, evidence-based approach to medicine, the mystical appeal of mumia began to wane. The idea of eating ground-up corpses started to seem less like a cure and more like the superstition it was. By the 19th century, the practice had largely died out in medicine, though mummies continued to hold a morbid fascination. They were famously unwrapped at public parties in Victorian England, a form of macabre entertainment. But their time as a staple of the European medicine cabinet was over. The story of mummy powder is a stark reminder of how different past worldviews were from our own. It shows a time when the lines between medicine, magic, and cannibalism were incredibly blurry. It's a practice that seems utterly alien to us now, but for hundreds of years it was simply what the doctor ordered, a spoonful of dust from a long-dead Egyptian to cure what ails you. So there you have it, 5 medical practices that range from the misguided to the downright horrifying. From draining a patient's blood to cure a fever, to drilling holes in their skull to release evil spirits, to prescribing deadly poisons and surgically scrambling their brains. It's a stark and humbling look at the long, often brutal road that medicine has traveled. It makes you realize that progress isn't just about discovering new things, but also about having the courage to abandon old ideas, no matter how entrenched they are. These stories aren't just here to shock us or make us feel smugly superior in our modern age. They are a profound reminder of the importance of the scientific method, of skepticism, of evidence, and of the constant need to question our own assumptions. The doctors prescribing these treatments weren't monsters, they were the best and brightest of their time, doing what they genuinely believed was right. And that thought should give us all a moment of pause and a dose of intellectual humility. I am incredibly curious to know what you all think. Which of these practices did you find the most shocking or unbelievable? Was it the ice pick lobotomy, the mercury cure, or maybe the idea of taking mummy powder as medicine? Let me know in the comments below, I'd love to read your reactions. And if you enjoy diving into the wild and weird corners of history, please make sure to subscribe to Dewtime and hit that notification bell. We have so much more to explore together. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.